This is going to be a really interesting talk about the lived experience of the impact of Lariam neurotoxicity in veterans. So I'll let Dave introduce himself, and best of luck.
Most people that come to speak at these events are here because they've been successful. Only I'm here because I haven't. For the 20 plus years, despite the best efforts from myself at surviving the most horrendous adverse symptoms of Mefloquine toxicity, that's just trashed me, my family, and also the wider veteran community, I've failed. And I need your help, which is why I've agreed to speak today. One of the challenges when I was offered to speak at this event was, how was I ever going to deliver 20 years of Lariam toxicity in just 20 minutes? Just completely impossible. Almost a half a lifetime of suffering. So whilst this is going to be a whistle-stop tour into Lariam toxicity, or chronic quinoline encephalopathy, or Quinism, I really need this to be about you, your awareness, your clients' and families' awareness, and how you can make a difference to the veteran cohort. My experience with a drug first took place during a rapid deployment to Sierra Leone with one para battle group in May 2000 on Lot Palliser. I didn't even know where Sierra Leone was, to be fair. So once we'd gone to the queue, got our ammunition, got our jungle boots, jungle hunt, and went over there for an in-brief, I'd really no idea. And I certainly had no idea about the wider threat of tropical diseases. But after 5 days of being in theatre, I kind of got a good idea of the tropical threats. One day, say 8 days later, I was just finished guard, and I just walking across the compound, and I was tossed a couple of packets of Lariam by a couple of the blokes, and just as I was finished the guard shift, and I went over to my mate. They were just putting their anti-malarial drugs away in their kit, and just by asking around, I was like, right, how many of these do you take, guys? Yeah, one tablet a week, Dave. So, I was a little bit skeptical. I'd never heard of one tablet a week. But to be fair, I'd pretty much done anything to stop being eaten alive by then. So I took my tablet pretty much straight away. After the first dose and within hours, I wasn't feeling quite right. I was feeling a bit nauseous. I'd lost my appetite. I can remember at the evening brief, I was getting a set of orders from A1 Echelon. I was feeling dizzy when I sat down. I can remember writing the notes and losing focus and having blurred vision whilst I was trying to write, and that kind of come and went as throughout the tour. I wasn't going to say anything because we're on an operational tour, and we're meant to be roughy tufty soldiers, so you just kind of crack on. But certainly that night I didn't sleep, and in fact I hardly slept for the whole duration of the tour. And I thought, what, maybe if I can just take on more water and maybe get rid of this dehydration, I'll be in a better place. Little did I know, though, within days that the symptoms going to get much, much worse. I was feeling paranoid. I felt that every African kind of person that was passing me was a threat or an enemy. I had really unusual thoughts, aggressive thoughts, about brutal kind of killings, which are completely, out of the norm. The depressed mood was kicking in, and, the feelings that I shouldn't have been there. I didn't need to be there. I can remember one time, actually, in terms of hallucinations, there was two small African children, one of them carrying an AK-47, and as I was going over to the UN compound, disappeared into the bush. And in terms of vivid dreams, I can remember, during the night, you could hear everybody else like screaming in the middle of the night. In fact, whilst we were there, one lad in one para woke up from a Mefloquine dream and shot himself in the forearm. I'm not quite sure how you do that, but yeah, he wasn't the only one. My mate Phil next to me, he woke up screaming, and he was being pinned down by a big spider. But fortunately, mine weren't quite as funky as that. I was just talking to my deceased granddad about his two dogs, Squibs and Piddles. And I know in the morning it was so lifelike and real. I was looking over the kind of compound wall looking for him. It was so vivid. If only I'd been aware of maybe the black box warning, or been briefed, or had a risk assessment in line with like the MOD policy. Because ultimately, the continued use of Mefloquine in the presence of these prodromal symptoms, these symptoms I was experiencing, not only risk further intoxication, but as to a more serious event. And a drug should have been discontinued. I never knew that, and nobody else knew that. In fact, it was a bit of a laughing joke that having these funky dreams was all part and parcel of taking the Lariam dreams. As soon as I got back after about a month in Africa, I got back to Colchester and reported immediately to the medical reception centre straight away. I wasn't in a good place. I was dripping with sweat, and I really thought I'd caught some tropical disease. The way I was feeling, the way my symptoms were. So I got tested straight away. In a couple of days, it came back as negative. Oddly enough, I had to keep taking the drug throughout. We were told to just finish off the rest of the Lariam when you get back as well. That way you're well protected. But my family started to notice the change and the mood swings and how I'd avoided. I'd become a completely different person. They experienced me. One night I threw myself out of bed from the vivid dreams that I was having. So knowing that, I could risk my full career by going to the doctor. As I've seen with other soldiers when they talked about mental health, I've seen their careers, stopped, binned, and ruined, and I was really anxious about that. But I took great courage and I went to see an army doctor. One of the difficult things is, I've never experienced mental health before. I didn't even know what words to use. There's certainly no mental health for my family or anything like that. And I was really trying to stumble over my words, trying to explain the symptoms, trying to explain my experience and what I've been feeling, what I've been going through. But literally within a split second, the doctor shut me down straight away. Look, you don't have PTSD. You didn't see any action. Stop wasting my time. I couldn't believe what he'd just done. He just destroyed me, and I was petrified that my chain of command was going to find this out. My career was going to be over. So there's no way that I was ever going to talk about this ever again, or certainly ever get help. The only thing I could do to survive was suppress my symptoms, push them away. I had to mask my emotions and put on a face that smile on the outside, but literally dying on the inside. I became a workaholic. Not only to avoid my family and being a completely horrible monster, but to just keep me distracted. One of the benefits of being away is of being a workaholic is that I was working in a training environment, so I was able to release some aggression. But the symptoms were persistent and they were immensely tiring. Trying to fight the symptoms, depression, putting on an act. Absolutely horrendous, and the fact I couldn't release any aggression and made me so tired, I'd just become a completely different person. It started to turn inwards. Suicide ideation was really kicking in, and it really wasn't in a good place. After 4 years of suppressing the symptoms, it really was just too much. And in a split second, I hanged myself. That really hurts. It was my 8-year-old son that found me. I was blue, lifeless. There was blood pouring from the back of my head. And 3 days later, I was woken up in Colchester ICU in a most horrendous state. Little did I know that this was just going to be the next chapter in Lariam toxicity. So I talked about sanctuary trauma earlier, and that initial doctor's appointment was so important, where he could have saved my life and saved other people's lives if he had taken a time to understand Lariam. It wasn't a new phenomena. Lariam toxicity and the adverse effects have been around since '89. Even the World Health Organization, slammed it when it was first marketed. But the point is that when you go in to see the doctor, you expect to get the help and support, but instead you just get this invalidation, gaslighting, or rejection that just pushes you further and further into this trauma, and like myself, just squirreling it all away, and that's just got to stop. So what kind of experience in terms of sanctuary trauma have I gone through? The list is endless, to be fair. When you're in that crisis mode, when I left the army and I was thinking about taking my life again and I was in a poor state, I approached combat stress in a desperate need, but they didn't screen or acknowledge Lariam toxicity. If I see my GP, To be told that, well, it's got a long half-life, but the drug will be out of your system by now. I fully understand that, but this is a neurotoxic drug. As it passes through the blood-brain barrier, it causes permanent and persistent damage to the brain. I've tried engaging with adult mental health services, and the immediate phenomena was, you're military. So you've been diagnosed with PTSD. No, this is Lariam toxicity. And it was a case, what's that? I tried engaging with the Foundation Trust, and as I spoke to the strategic director, which was, really great, and I'm really interested, they said, thanks, Dave, but yeah, that's really interesting. But if we'll concentrate on PTSD, because that was bringing us in more funding. That just wasn't the answer I wanted to hear. The CCG, when they ran a series of training sessions, hearing hidden voices in mental health and well-being, I was rejected, saying that, we've already got people talking about veteran issues. Misdiagnosis, I was misdiagnosed by the psychiatrist who'd just been given, depressive disorder. And when I went to see the tropical medicine and infectious diseases place, whilst they agreed that the symptoms were consistent with Lariam toxicity, he wasn't a psychiatrist, so couldn't actually make the diagnosis. Similarly, consistent cognitive assessments by the neuropsychologist, they also couldn't diagnose Lariam toxicity based on the lack of research and match controls as well. So I was left in limbo yet again. I thought maybe the MOD would be able to help. With Veterans UK, with a name like that, you would expect them to square you away. The Secretary of State rejected war pensions claim. So as it went to tribunal, and totally by surprise, and to such relief, the whole panel agreed and unanimously that my symptoms were down to Lariam toxicity. And if you don't know what the panel consists of, is a military member, a judge, and also a senior doctor. And it just so happened that the military member was the former colonel of the parachute regiment, Giles Orpen Smelly. And it actually turns out he was the regimental 2IC of one para on Up Palliser. He categorically said that he fully understood that this was all down to Lariam toxicity, and that he also had to deal with the after effects in his battalion, in the regiment, when he got back. I thought I'd flag this up a little bit further, and I approached the veteran advisor, the Office of Veteran Affairs. But after chasing for months on end, and being pushed aside, I was told, well, this is only very, very rare, and only affects only a small number of people, so still no help. I thought I'd approach General the Lord Dannant as well. He's had lived experiences with his son Bertie. It conflicted with what had been told by the Office of Veteran Affairs, where he believed there was a high number of cases. There's only one place I could take it further, by taking it to my own MP, who had no idea, and referred it back to Johnny Mercer, that managed through the Defence Select Committee to get the drug labelled a drug of last resort, although Johnny didn't really want to take it any further. If you go to the .gov website, there's actually now a Mefloquine information signposting for former service personnel. At the bottom line, after you read all the stuff, it says, go back to your GP. So there we are, we're stuck in this never-ending washing machine of sanctuary trauma and no help, treatment or acknowledgement. At the same time as well, none of the military service charities or service leads mention Lariam or Mefloquine on their websites, and they will not respond or communicate with this type of neurotoxic brain injury. Where do we go? I've lost count how many struggling veterans that have reached out to me online in fear of the never-ending sanctuary trauma or looking to take their own life. Only 2 weeks ago, I was chatting to a lad, ex-free para, that reached out to me, telling me that it was struggling and it was going to take his own life. And he was petrified about getting pushed back into this washing machine, being diagnosed with PTSD, when clearly it was Lariam. This guy had never been on an operational tour. In fact, where his issue started when he went to Kenya, was given Lariam, and subsequently piled in on that. The thing is, he's not the only one. And I've spoken to hundreds, if not thousands of people from around the world that have all experienced Mefloquine toxicity. And what's important to note as well is that some of the people on these as well are also civilians that have also been subjected to the drug. So neurotoxicity is not a new phenomena. It's this type of acquired brain injury that causes a physical damage to the brain and brainstem. There's all sorts of examples. You got PANS and PANDAS. You've got antivirals, anesthesia in children, carbon monoxide poisoning, even lead poisoning as well causes neurotoxic damage to the brain. It's interesting because lead poisoning wasn't really recognised until the 80s. So what was it before then? And even more so, PTSD wasn't recognised until the 80s as well. So what was that called before then? Cowardice? Yeah, shell shock? Some of you guys might remember the tragic case of the student Alana Cutland that took her own life jumping from a plane flying over Madagascar. Now, I've spoken with her father after reports of her being on Lariam, and whilst this went cold in the inquiry, it still shows how the adverse effects of anti-malaria drugs can cause psychosis and suicide. So where's there a problem? Well, there's biased research funding, where the research is more profitable and not beneficial to the patient. There's biased medical journals and media. There's commercial conflicts of interest. Awareness, education of clinicians that just don't understand this as a root cause. All they see is a sticky plaster. You've got symptoms. It's PTSD, and that inability to diagnose Lariam or misdiagnose with the default diagnosis of convenience, PTSD. There's no long-term follow-up on these patients, certainly not during the trials, and certainly those presented the symptoms. And there's no interest to either. There's lack of medical records by those that have suffered and the soldiers that are leaving the military. And the MOD has a disregard to its authority and regulators. Just down there's a letter from June Rain. Now, I mentioned earlier that Defence Select Committee required the MOD to make Mefloquine a drug of last resort. And so the MOD carried out a study that was meant to be published in 2016. Now, they blatantly turned around to the MHRA and withheld it. And this study is being put on the shelf and allowed to gather dust despite annual chases by Defence Select Committee to see this research. I wonder why. Up until last night, there were 68 suicides that we know of. We're now on 69. I know the lads from the Rifles have sustained heavy losses from suicide, but there's a common denominator here that's been consistently overlooked. And I've spoken to the guys and confirmed that the majority of them were on Lariam, both in Kenya prior to deployment for Afghanistan, and also in Afghanistan as well. And it's ironic that, whilst they've taken 26 losses just this year, that it's not been looked into. And this is where veteran suicide continues to be ignored by the MOD, and where information has been passed on that Ministry of Justice coroner's inquests have not investigated it properly. I'm not going to name specific names now or specific cases, but you might recognise a few names in there. But you can read about them in a forthcoming book called If You Wake at Midnight, the Lariam Wonder Drug Scandal, and that should be released at the end of this year, beginning of next. So one for your Christmas stocking. But these are true stories, so I'd recommend getting that. So how can you help? We need to be screening. Did they take Lariam? And did they suffer adverse effects? So when they're presenting symptoms to you, you need to be on it. You need to be training researchers to distinguish the effects of Lariam toxicity from other disorders such as PTSD and TBI. Clinical guidance is a massive, massive key importance here. We need to be drafting this clinical guidance to give confidence to the clinicians to make that diagnosis, instead of pushing guys around and around this wash machine of never-ending trauma. Investigate the veterans' med docs thoroughly. And if they haven't got any, assume that they did take Lariam. I can't express how wide Lariam was taken from the mid-90s onwards. And for Kenya, Belize, Brunei, Afghan, Iraq, the guys have been on this drug and it's completely overlooked. Think neurology, not just mental health. But most importantly, listen. Believe your patients and avoid this sanctuary trauma that's pushing them further and further into this trauma. You'll be saving lives. If you want to know more, I'm quite happy to be contacted personally. I'd also recommend checking out the Quinism Foundation that are the subject matter experts on this. Thanks for your time.
It's a very, very powerful presentation. I think I was sort of hanging off of every word in relation to that. So thank you. And I think it's really a sort of a call to action for the clinicians on the call to really, I know there's representatives here from the military charities, from the TIL, CTS and potentially HIS services. And I think we can probably all admit, if we're honest, that we haven't necessarily asked the question and we haven't thought what to do with that if the answer is yes and the symptoms are consistent. So, I certainly will be speaking with colleagues and maybe pushing around research, with colleagues perhaps at Anglia Ruskin University, at the Veterans Families Institute. These are really important topics that we need to address. It's not all about PTSD. And in fact, we may be causing trauma by labeling something as trauma that isn't trauma, when it's actually Lariam neurotoxicity. And for those of you who were on a previous presentation a few months ago around PANS and PANDAS, which is obviously another massive passion of mine, which is the paediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with strep infections, that kind of etiology is very similar to this. And so I share some of Dave's frustration in the lack of awareness and the lack of acceptance of this as a condition, nationally, really, and much more needs to be done. So, that is a significant ask of everyone on this call to go away, talk to your colleagues, spread the word, ask the question, and start to think about what you can do so that Dave and people like Dave do not continue to experience that sanctuary trauma. Are there any questions or comments that people would like to add? I think there's some in the box, actually. I'm going to go through a couple of these quickly. Let's have a look. Thank you for sharing your experiences. There's lots of thank yous on here. Is this condition, so Jane Burt has asked, is this condition recognised in other countries? So Dave, you're able to comment on that? And another question, so there's lots of sort of positive praise, saying it's very thought-provoking and thank you, very helpful. Another question was just, is Lariam still prescribed? And just another couple of comments that just say, thanks Dave, really appreciated your openness. This has been a very compelling presentation. And somebody requesting, I think it was Suzanne Powell at Essex Partnership Trust, requesting a copy of the slides if possible. Lovely. I'm just going to move back to the list of attendees because I can't see. Andrew.
Marriott's got his hand up. Diane.
Yeah.
Yes, please. First of all, I'd actually like to thank Dave, but he said at the beginning of his presentation he'd failed himself, but actually behind one of those slides where he mentioned a lot of deaths, it has to be pointed out that Dave, through his personal interventions, will have saved countless people from doing what he used that euphemism, checking out early. And I just want to reinforce the point that it's actually ground level work that has been driven largely by Dave and other people in countries like Canada, Australia, and the United States that are raising the level of awareness. And just one slight correction on the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence still continues to administer this drug and has not accepted many of the findings, both of clinicians and the Defence Select Committee. And it was the Defence Select Committee who said that this must be a drug of last resort. There's a great deal of work to do here, but having travelled this journey, I served myself. I did 35 years and consumed almost 50 of these drugs in 2003. I've shared some of the experiences along with Dave, and we've only met a few times since we both left, but to use a well-known military idiom, I would share a trench with him anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it was really powerful. I mean, I actually went cold and my hairs were sort of actually stood on end listening to that speech, and how brave and how tremendously powerful that was, and the openness. And, I can't really thank you both enough for coming along and being so open about something that is really distressing and frustrating. And I wanted to give a voice and a platform because I think as clinicians we have a responsibility to hear everybody's voices, not just the voices that agree with our own opinions and agenda. And so it's really important that we hear what everybody has to say and do what we can. So I think we've got a question from Brendan.
Yeah, hi, thanks Dan. Just a quick question. I'm just thinking out loud, and back to my experience in Gulf War I. Is there any evidence to suggest that a cocktail of drugs or immunisations could have a similar effect or similar effects that Lariam does? And is there any evidence to support that?
I think a relevant point to raise here is that for some reason there has been great institutional resistance to exploring the problems. And that's been particularly so here. There was actually an investigation conducted within the European Union, which resulted in a 2014 report by the European Medicines Agency. And importantly, having looked at a range of case studies across Europe, they did confirm that there was a causal link between the use of the drug and the onset of long-term and even persistent neuropsychiatric damage. But when we've approached major institutions, to quote one of the responses, it's simply not on their to-do list, and that's what we need to shift.
Thank you. And hopefully this will be a catalyst for people to go away from this meeting. It certainly made me think within the services that I manage about how we're going to ask the question and what we're going to then do with that, and how we can perhaps try and influence those in research to pick up on this. And I read the Defence Select Committee report, and obviously it did say it was a drug of last resort, but you know, as you say, that doesn't mean it's not being used. And if we know the harm it's doing, I think what Professor Neil Greenberg said earlier was, you know, first do no harm. So it's yeah. But anyway, thank you so much. That's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you taking the time to come and join us, and you're welcome to stay for the rest of the event. Our next speaker is my wonderful colleague, Dr. Alison Woods, and I've asked her to do a talk for us around the sort of neuropsychology, because it fits in nicely around the talk you've just had. So how do we look at those who potentially may have a brain injury, they may have PTSD, they may have both? How do we assess them, and what are the treatment considerations? So I'll hand over to Ali.
Thank you, Diane. Can you see my presentation from there, Diane? Is that
We can, yeah.
Fab. Okay. So wow, it's quite a presentation to follow from yours, Dave. It's very moving, and I've learned a lot already. So thank you. I've got some things to look up in terms of revising. It was an amazing talk. So thank you. So I'm a clinical psychologist, as Dan said, with the team NSFT, working since January with the COVID support service and internal staff support service. But my experience has very much been for the last 15 years in neuropsychology, in particular complex ABI rehabilitation, including traumatic brain injury. That's been in Norfolk in a specialist service. And since January, I've been in the support service with Diane's team. And I haven't got experience currently with kind of military veterans, so I'm really new to that. But again, I've already learned a lot just in this meeting, which is amazing, and I shall be learning some more. Obviously, the topics of PTSD, mental health, TBI are massive topics. And in 20 minutes, I'm going to give, again, like Dave said, a kind of whistle-stop tour. But I think also it's worth mentioning that any of these topics I'm going to talk about could be sessions in themselves. So if you have any thoughts around that, it'd be great if you want to email me or let Diane know. And I've put my email address on the slides, and you can have the presentation if you'd like that after as well. I must just say I need to leave fairly promptly for a regular therapy session at the end. So, but that's why I put my email address on if you want to contact me. Okay, so just a little bit of background. As I said, I'm not someone experienced at all in working with military, but I just thought I'd look in terms of sort of rates of TBI really. So between 2000 and 2017, more than 375,000 military personnel have been diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury, with around 80% categorised as mild, around 9% moderate, and 1% kind of severe traumatic brain injury. And it's worth thinking about the fact that many people who sustain a traumatic brain injury may also develop PTSD, as a TBI is often from a stressful or traumatic event, such as combat-related incidents. But with my experience, that was much more around assault, falls, car accidents, that kind of thing, which leads to many people having this concurrent diagnosis of PTSD and TBI. In a recent paper, which I've referenced, by the way, at the end, so you can find that by Rosen et al., they really stress the importance of accurately diagnosing PTSD and comorbid TBI, and that without that careful screening, as kind of Dave's presentation really highlighted there, you could end up with multiple psychiatric diagnoses before accurately being diagnosed with PTSD, and as Dave said, and actually missing a different diagnosis, which might be the Lariam toxicity. So there's a real importance to diagnose. And also within my experience, obviously more within brain injury, there are many incidents of mild traumatic brain injury which aren't diagnosed and therefore are not treated. And this then impedes recovery both from PTSD and the brain injury. And also Rose Natal cites some figures there around prevalence rates of PTSD of between kind of 5 and 20% from veterans serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. So just a little bit of quick background on that. Also just worth pointing out that it's now well established that traumatic brain injury and PTSD are not mutually exclusive, and you can have PTSD even without a sort of complete recollection and memory of what's happened to you, the trauma. And that also may be due to what you've heard from other people about what happened to you that can cause the trauma, things that happen in the aftermath of the trauma, and also how you were treated. So really interesting to hear about sanctuary trauma, because that's something I hadn't heard of and feels so relevant to that piece of my talk there. There's also the risk of PTSD to think about after a traumatic brain injury. So if you imagine you have damage to the prefrontal cortex in a TBI, that could affect your capacity to assess danger risk. You could also have a risk of traumatic brain injury after PTSD if you have slowed kind of central processing, reduced attention, and maybe an inability to screen out irrelevant information. Or it might be more of a psychological effect, that you don't feel worthwhile, your self-esteem is low, and you're unable to protect yourself from risky situations. So quite a lot of complex relationships there. Now I've put together a really brief illustration of what might be a sort of typical case we might have in a veterans trauma service. And again, this comes very much from my experience in brain injury rather than with veterans, but hopefully it feels like there's a fit. So if you imagine a referral of Robert, a veteran in his 50s, recently involved in a road traffic collision, which is where I would usually see people with brain injury in previous experience. Imagining another car owner was seriously injured in the accident, and Robert's had this traumatic brain injury highlighted, struggling at work, disturbed sleep, and has been reporting changes with regard to his eating patterns and drinking, with a tendency to overeat and drinking more alcohol. In clinic appears to be maybe a bit low and unmotivated, yet he's reporting the accident hasn't really affected him very much and he kind of feels okay. So the referral is asking for assessment and some advice as to treatment options. And the kind of presentation in session for this example, we think about Robert maybe being reluctant to talk about the accident he was in, maybe changing the subject frequently, downplaying any negative consequences of what happened, minimising the impact on him, maybe appearing to be a bit rejecting of empathy and validation, a bit dismissive of support that was offered and maybe easily irritated, and some distinct kind of lack of detail around what happened in the accident, and maybe doesn't really see how therapy is going to help him. So, and I don't mean that to be kind of stereotypical at all, but this is the kind of things that we might see. And what I wanted to illustrate very briefly in this talk is how we unravel what some of these symptoms could be. So what could be due to the traumatic brain injury in that presentation that I've just described? Could there be some cognitive impairment as a result of that road traffic collision? Could there be previous traumatic brain injury related to military service that may have not been diagnosed? We don't know. Are these symptoms of mental health conditions? Are these pre-morbid, pre-road traffic accident? Are there symptoms of PTSD and TBI? And with all this in mind, how might we approach the assessment formulation of this case and then devise an appropriate treatment plan? And further to that, how might we adapt interventions in the context of cognitive impairment for trauma? And again, as I said, these could all be topics that could be hours in themselves. So apologies for sort of rapidly going through these topics. So just thinking initially about what kind of hypotheses we might have. So just thinking about emotional and psychological well-being. So leaving PTSD, TBI aside for a moment. So we could be seeing some potential psychological denial, feelings of guilt and shame about the accident, maybe feeling that if he expresses his feelings, he'll appear weak or he'll feel really vulnerable. That might be why he's avoiding conversation. There could be some suppression of some difficult thoughts and feelings around what's happened, maybe avoiding external reminders of the accident. Then with this tendency to minimise the impact, is this related to low self-esteem, low self-worth? Maybe doesn't feel he deserves help. Could there be fear of rejection? Could this be a symptom of depression? Again, the case study talked about a lack of motivation. Could that again be related to depression, anxiety? Could this be pre-morbid or a result of the accident or something else? Could Robert feel quite hopeless about the future? Is that related to the lack of motivation? We hear about him being easily irritated. Again, could be due to depression, anxiety, lack of sleep. And again, there are multiple hypotheses here, so I'm just obviously presenting some of these. This also idea about him being maybe reluctant to engage in therapy and a little bit dismissive of therapy, could that again relate to low self-esteem, low self-worth, feeling he needs to be strong and needs to be able to cope? And I was very aware of that when Dave gave his talk. I think some really interesting points around coming forward for therapy. These attentional and memory difficulties have been highlighted in the referral. Again, could that be due to depression? Could it be due to anxiety? And these changes to eating and drinking habits, again, could be symptoms of depression, anxiety. Are they pre-morbid, since a car accident? Are they to do with military experience? Are these a way of coping with difficult thoughts and feelings? So many hypotheses, and as again, I'm just touching on a few here. But when we start to think about cognitive impairment, so with my brain injury hat on, this tendency to be easily irritated, I might think, is he disinhibited? Is there some emotional dysregulation? Is it a low tolerance to frustration that could be the relation to the traumatic brain injury? Changes to eating and drinking habits, could this be due to impulsivity, impulse control difficulties? Could there be memory lapses? Because I've certainly seen people where a memory has affected their routine and remembering what they've been doing during the day. When we think about people who may be reluctant to engage in therapy or a bit dismissive of therapy, I mean, lots of reasons why that could be the case, but I might be thinking, is there some reduced insight into what happened? Does he have a lack of awareness because of a brain injury about the difficulties he has? And that's why he can't really see how therapy is going to help him. Changing the topic when asked about the accident, is he quite susceptible to distraction? Does he have impaired attention? Is it hard for him to sustain attention? Could be that in terms of brain injury. Then this idea that he might be having trouble accepting validation and maybe empathy. And we know if you work in brain injury, often there can be sort of self-identity changes post-TBI and a kind of disrupted sense of self, which can be really destabilizing for people. Maybe he feels self-critical and doesn't deserve the help, and that can really get in the way of accepting validation. With the concentration and memory difficulties, again, could this be due to cognitive impairment post-TBI and some impaired attention, maybe some executive problems? Sleep disturbance, you know, if you work in sort of brain injury, often fatigue is one of the most pronounced symptoms and an ongoing symptom of a brain injury, and can cause a lot of daytime sleeping, which then disturbs sleep at nighttime. Could be that explaining the sleep disturbance. And then just thinking about low motivation, could be due to depression, could be a motivational disorder as a result of brain injury. He may have difficulty initiating activity, or he may have difficulty setting a goal. He may have difficulties cognitively in planning and scheduling activities to reach his goal. So when I started to look at this topic with a kind of brain injury perspective, there were so many other hypotheses around explaining these symptoms. And then just looking at sort of PTSD, you know, again, you could explain it in terms of easily irritated, being around hyperarousal, sleep disturbance, fatigue, anxiety. Maybe he's avoiding reminders of the traffic accident because of PTSD. He could have some low self-worth connected to some negative cognitions about the accident, some feelings of guilt and shame potentially. The concentration and memory difficulties could be a sign of fragmented recall of the incident. It could be quite distracted and anxious and have sleep disturbance because of PTSD. And he may be experiencing some symptoms around kind of nightmares, flashbacks, hyperarousal. And then with the changes to eating and drinking habits, could this be because of high arousal? Are there attempts to kind of numb high levels of distress and cope with this distress and arousal? So kind of looking at this, you can see there's such a big overlap between symptoms, even just between depression, anxiety, PTSD, TBI, and a whole host of other diagnoses, which makes accurate diagnosis quite complicated. And the recent paper I mentioned by Rosen et al., they do try to attempt to describe both the overlap in symptoms of TBI and PTSD, as well as those which you might say are more specific to TBI and PTSD. So that's quite an interesting paper to look at. And again, probably is a session in itself to sort of go through that. And then if we think about how might we start to look at the cognitive impairment. So again, with my background in neuropsychology, I might be thinking of the value of a holistic neuropsychological assessment. So at least we can start to tease out some of these things. So testing pre-morbid IQ, so we've got something to compare to current performance and some kind of measure of effort testing. We'd also typically obviously have some standardized cognitive tests of the main cognitive domains, plus potentially some executive function tests if it felt relevant. And also within a holistic assessment, what we'd also be looking at is mood assessment, any history of mental health difficulties, substance use issues, a history in terms of development and trauma history, physical health, fatigue. So we're starting to put a real picture together of some of these difficulties, when they were becoming problems. Was it before the accident? Was it during the military career? Is it very recent? And it can help then to start to think about how you diagnose and assess. Also, I'd typically look at an assessment of insight and awareness with maybe a schedule such as the self-awareness of deficits interviewed by Fleming. So, could there be a real lack of insight and disrupted awareness due to a brain injury, which is getting in the way of the cognitive impairment? So that might be something that comes up, and we can think about that. Also, a good neuropsychological assessment will also involve lots of liaison and consultation. So that could be with family, partners, carers and employers, which can really help to think about pre-morbid factors such as personality, mood, coping style, motivation and history, and can help you to see whether there are inconsistencies or are there exacerbations of previous difficulties, which again can help you to start to tease out some of these difficult overlaps. Also, obviously thinking about the nature of the traumatic brain injury, what's the mechanism of injury? So in this case, we're thinking of a road traffic collision, but there could have been a previous TBI to think about as well. What might we expect with that kind of mechanism of injury to be the cognitive deficits? What might we see? Are there scans and are there previous assessments? Also, within neuropsychological assessment, we might use some behavioural and functional assessments as well, with some good ecological and face validity. So it might be more sort of real world tests to see how Robert copes with certain situations. I've just put on here the MET, so multiple errands test is a good example of taking someone into a shop, establishing a schedule in terms of what you want them to buy from different departments in a particular order, maybe within a particular time limit, within a structured order, within a certain budget, and then you'd observe how they actually do that in the shop. So it gives you much more of a real world observation of how they cope in those situations rather than just pen and paper tests. So again, whistle stop tour there, that could be a whole session in itself, but hopefully gives you a flavour. And just wanted to mention this. So within brain injury rehabilitation, I've often used this kind of slightly adapted biopsychosocial formulation of ABI by Evans and Wilson. I just wanted to mention that because this is quite a useful way of seeing, as you can see with all the arrows, interrelationships between certain factors. And also it brings on board pre-morbid factors, social support within the context of the brain pathology. Then you can put onto here the impairments and the strengths, which are really important, that you can see on cognitive assessment, how the strengths might help to reduce some of the impact of impairments. Again, what the functional consequences might be of things that they're going through, how they present in session, physical function. And also when you think about that central part of mood, you can start to think about these mental health difficulties potentially, what might be to do with loss because of brain injury. Is there an impact of insight? Because obviously if someone doesn't have insight into their difficulties, their mood may be fairly protected, but if they have very good insight into a traumatic brain injury and what's happened to them, their mood may well come down, and that might be a difficulty. So I just thought I'd mention that as one way that we would formulate, and I certainly find it very useful when teasing apart all these different factors. Okay, and I don't know how I am for time actually, Dan. Am I okay? Yeah, it's covered up my clock. Okay, so what we can think about, and the benefit really of neuropsychological assessment, is we can get a profile of potential cognitive impairment. And then I started to think about what might be the cognitive demands of a trauma treatment. So in terms of EMDR, are we thinking that kind of loads very much on working memory? So if we know that Robert has a particular cognitive profile, how might we support him if he was to have EMDR? Would it be an appropriate treatment? And how might we engage him with that? So again, a whole nother session probably on looking at what the cognitive load is of certain PTSD treatments and how we might support those. Rose and et al. In this recent paper do cite numerous fairly recent studies which have demonstrated that modifications have been made to PTSD treatment that have showed some good benefits for people with comorbid TBI, so that's kind of good to know. And Carlson also has highlighted that in addition to cognitive difficulties, we need to kind of bear in mind with a TBI there may be other factors that kind of interfere with trauma work that we need to think about in terms of emotional regulation, impulse control, and those kind of things. So again, a big topic here, but with ABI, and obviously my experience has been very much in rehabilitation, there are things you can do to adapt assessments and therapy sessions if there is a traumatic brain injury, and that might be around obviously careful pacing and the timing of sessions. And by that, I mean fatigue is a huge issue for many people after a brain injury. Slow speed of processing also very common, so you need to think about timing of sessions, careful pacing, but also what is an optimal time of day to potentially do an assessment. You wouldn't want to schedule that in because it wouldn't be reliable and valid if it wasn't a good day for their performance. Shorter sessions, frequent summaries, lots of reminders are really helpful. Visual aids, I've relied on those so much in neuro rehab, recording of sessions and very tailored handouts. So I wouldn't rely on kind of off-the-shelf handouts for people. I really would think about the profile of cognitive impairment and tailor those to the individual, which really seemed to work well. Frequently checking understanding and clarifying frequently, which I think is important in any session, to be honest, any therapy session. Building compassion, self-validation to help to reduce any high anxiety and high arousal. And that's also really important when assessing, particularly a formal cognitive assessment, because you want to get the best out of someone's performance. And actually having an IQ test is actually really quite threatening and quite unnerving. I mean, I've never had one, and I hope I never have to have one. I would like it very much. And I think we sometimes underestimate, how difficult that is to sit with someone and have your IQ tested. That is pretty a hard thing to do, and obviously can cause some anxiety. And then just thinking about tools that you might have in terms of therapy assessment to support emotional expression. So apart from the difficulties I've mentioned around talking and expressing emotions, there can also be brain injury that might affect the ability to name and identify and express emotion. So just things like this kind of sheet that has the kind of main primary emotions, secondary emotions, that's something that I might use in a session to help someone to think about what they might be feeling and what options there are. That could be quite helpful. Whew. Okay, so that was a very quick introduction to lots of different areas. And as I said, if you've got ideas about maybe extending any of those topics to a longer session, I'd love to hear from you. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ali. I mean, as you said, I think that, you've covered so much in that short presentation, and probably each area of that could be a whole session in itself. But I just think it shows the complexity of that symptom overlap. So, you can have, it's pure PTSD, it's pure brain injury, it's both, or perhaps they had a brain injury and now they've ended up with trauma because of, as Dave describes, that sanctuary trauma, that their difficulties were blamed on mental health, the brain injury isn't acknowledged, and then they end up with trauma, and the people say, see, I told you you had trauma, but they didn't have trauma in the first place. They didn't have psychological trauma in the first place. They've just ended up developing that because their brain injury hasn't been properly assessed or diagnosed. And I found it really useful the last slide in particular, around the different strategies, because there's many clinicians obviously on the call and using those strategies, and in fact even non-clinicians who are working in some of our charity sector in sort of welfare and other supportive roles, the way that you give out information, the way that you book appointments, give out information, how you write your letters, what leaflets you give out, etc. Obviously all can potentially be adapted.